In the first lessons of drawing, one of the things you have to understand is how to understand proportion. So you establish a unit of measure, and in that unit, then you compare the rest of the world that you see in front of you. This kind of visualization is one of the first tools you learn as an artist. Later in advanced studies, through anatomy, you might understand that the world that you look at exists by understanding what's happening with the systems underneath your body. And so these are the kinds of lessons and concepts that drew me to continue to make art in very different ways than drawing, but one that for me captures that same idea of starting to look at a world with one detail and then accumulating that world in relativity. So this, I start with a unit, and the unit is a pant cuff. That's a unit related to my personal body and measurement. So I stand here on the stage, and you could see that I fall short of this fashion standards, exactly 3 inches short, and that is at the edge of my pant cuff. And those 3 units, which I have to alter in my fashion wear to accommodate myself, is these installations that you see here. So then I kept thinking about what it means to measure the body in that relationship. And so I went to all the alteration shops and imagined the exactitude of measurements that other people have. These measurements that actually don't exist in the world. I flipped the short person to be the tallest person in this landscape of pant cuffs. This kind of world looking at something that's invisible, that isn't available to us unless you start to look deeper. I started to imagine another unit, and the unit there was a discarded lotto ticket. In my Brooklyn studio, I would walk from home to the studio and always see this kind of discarded piece of paper. And I imagine if only that was an actual dollar. And we all know tickets are about $1, some with 5. And I would pick this up and look at it, and in fact, it was useless, it was trash. But for that person who was paying money, probably didn't have that dollar to spend, or the 5 or the 10 or the 50 that they spend every week. So why do they spend that money? What are they trying to get with this unit of measure in their life? And that made me think about why I go to the studio every day. There's an investment, and that investment doesn't happen instantly. You don't scratch and win instantly. In fact, what we understand about the kind of sense of purpose is that we believe that something will happen over time, over labor, over understanding that it is possible. So I started to build a city of chance based on all the discarded lotto tickets. And so we begin in a corner. It's like a performance. You begin. There's nothing holding it together except gravity, friction, and I like to say a little hope. So against all odds, these cities are built each time. And we know inevitably they will fall. They go right back into those boxes and get counted again for the next installation. This notion of a city being built out of dreams is something that I know. It also is about foundations on which you understand and build correctly as opposed to rushing. And we all know what happens in financial crisis. We know what impacts it makes on unemployment today. You also can sometimes arrive at material that comes to you. This boxes of records came to me after the death of my in-law's grandfather. He had apparently saved every record he had ever listened to and collected. So his personal collection came to me, and I said, Jean, do you have any idea what you might want to do with this? They were all broken. Many of us didn't even have a record player to play it. But what captivated me about this was, how can I activate this collection that was really his life? You know, a personal musical collection. So I started to melt the records and kind of imagine it much more fluid, alive, because that's what performance and music is all about. So I imagine, like his life as a metaphor, something that is at its height, awesome. And it's at height a visual wave that would take over and have the strength and power, right? And also, the inevitable is captured in this wave. We know that it will not sustain itself. We know that it will crash. And yet we enjoy that performance because it's fleeting, right? We enjoy that life because it's there. And so these records were really part of looking at the music production. CDs, do you remember them? Cassette players, do we remember those? They're all in our life, and at the time, we invest so much energy in these objects, but they're built for obsolescence. They're built for us to move on to the next stage. So that wave turns into an ocean, right? Calm once again until the resurgence of the next media, the next wave. I start to look at my installations as portraits of people. You start with an individual, the unit again, and then you expand in comparison. So prescription drugs were something that I looked at as something invisible to my body, but something that was essential to how I lived, essential to my community, my family. So I started to invite people to give me their prescription drugs because I thought, isn't it amazing that the contents of a pill could totally alter your body? And as I started to do that, I went to nursing homes, talking to people who were aging, and they were thrilled. Oh, this will make me take my cocktail of prescription drugs because I can give that to the artist who's making a sculpture. I invited my artist friends to give me their prescription pill drugs, their bottles, and then had many interesting conversations. My friend living with HIV said, I have boxes of them. Students who would say, it is a love-hate relationship since I am codependent on this drug to be who I am, dealing with mental illness. Other people would then look at this and tell me that they had struggled so much with the struggle of mental illness that they lost their son who took their own life. And I also understand the accessibility that we face with costs of drugs and who's available to them. So these are kind of the mortality that is in this little object, so effective and yet so dependent on our ability to be able to sustain a form in our life. I start to do these large-scale installations, and part of it is driven by the site of interest. This is the lobby of a GSA building in Baltimore, Maryland. And in fact, those are the places that my parents had actually immigrated with me. So I decided that I would turn the table and present an art project to the first immigrants coming in that day. So right before they were about to take their citizenship, I asked them, could you give me your shirt? And it was for an art project. They understood it, and this man is signing up right away to give me his shirt off his back. What I realized was I wanted to capture that journey of the immigrant. I wanted to map what it felt like to come here, because this for them is not the beginning. It has been a long journey to that point. And then I wanted to contrast that building where all these immigrants come to become naturalized with another office that the government runs, which was the Service for Veterans. And I wanted to understand the extreme existence of Americans. The first day coming was a long journey. And then as veterans, they leave in uniform out into the world to represent us. And that's a journey that they will forever be transformed and changed by. So that these two clothings, their uniforms and the first immigrants' clothes, come together to weave together an image of being American. Identity is something that I've always looked at, but looked at it in a very abstract way. I started to look at my own community and said, well, what if I represent each person by a clothing, which I've done before, but this time ask for a sweater? And so I would unravel these sweaters from the Asian American arts community. So every single person who I identified as being Asian American would give me a sweater. I would unravel their yarn into this lifeline and then reconnect them by identifying which sweater belongs to who. Basically, I'm creating a social network, a mapping, before there was Facebook. But every single time we installed, it would be a recreation of who knows who, who's most connected, who's least connected? How are we all connected? How do these relationships work? So again, trying to make visible something that is actually invisible to us all. And each time this installation would move, it would be like an ability to recreate that community, something that is actually always active, but also extremely vulnerable, one that would have to be reconnected. As I do these site-specific projects, some of the amazing institutions that I've been asked to do exhibitions and new works is at the Smithsonian American Art Museum. The site there I was really excited about was looking at Washington, D.C. And for me, having lived nearby, I looked at the place new to look at the monuments, the reasons people come to visit Washington, D.C. And this site is really the reason I thought was so important, that our forefathers had imagined leaving a space that was empty. And to me, that was the site of potential and something I wanted to talk about. And the reason is that most people leave it empty not because there isn't a valid reason, but that valid reason hasn't been known to them until people come together, like in Obama's inauguration, or sometimes in protest. So I wanted to say, well, what is a new monument that I could build that isn't a tribute to a person, but rather a tribute to the everyday man, their potential. So I started to gather trophies, because I thought trophies would be a way to kind of imagine that early innocent childhood idea that you could be anything. So I started to send out PTA invites, parents started to talk to each other, and of course everyone had saved these old relics of their childhood and their children's trophies. So those came to me. 2,000 trophies arrived in our studio. We started to look at these units very carefully. Some of my artist friends then were very cynical. Oh, sports. They always seem to overtake the conversation. Why are we so obsessed with that? Others, though, got my invitation and told me stories of parents who had traveled marathons, and her aging father, who couldn't walk now, were so excited to be able to donate their entire collection of trophies to have it migrate over to Washington, D.C. There were so many touching stories, but also the complexity and its conflicts and the contradictions. Others then questioned Americans' ideas of constantly rewarding people just for showing up. So I wanted to try to move the conversation away from sports and competition into the notion of an everyday monument. So I literally removed the apparatus of balls and sports, bats and so on. I repositioned their bodies so they're not in action poses, but rather poses of work, commonplaces. And I began to have this transformation in my studio. We started to rebuild the sculptures so that they all did poses of work, and then we moved them into the space of the gallery and brought them together to this long platform, which was a replica of the National Mall. And I filled the galleries with every trophy as if the person was arriving into the museum. And there we accumulated this idea of the everyday person. What happens to our children when they grow up? What happens to that sports hero? They're not stars necessarily, but who are we rewarding for the type of work we do every day, the type of things that matter today? And so as I had the work on display, I realized that people were actually coming to see the basketball player who's now a mechanic, the chef who's once a master of karate. So these kind of ideas were embedded. Of course, the mother who gave me that big trophy was also there, whose son had passed away. These ideas of the landscape is also prevalent. I was a landscape painter. These works are trees that I created out of silverware, looking at nature, but also looking at culture. So when we look at the beautiful silverware, we think of family traditions and etiquette and beautiful homes that entertain. But in reality, most of our day is thought of in terms of fast food, food to go. Sustainabilities are about eating and going to work. And so I think of how that affects ourselves, affects nature. So these are replicas of trees made out of flatware that have been cut. Some of that history is lost, just like our families are just fractured. So these welded trees that I collected show the history and the age and makes us think about what's happened to the landscape, what's happened to us, what's happened to our families. And then these kind of adoptive sense in the gallery, I have these grafted settings in which we take the best of it and we try to regenerate ideas of nature in kind of a different environment. The last project I want to show was an invitation when I did a project in New York City called Celadon Remnants. And it was a project in Flushing, Queens, when I imagined, what can I give to a public site with the Korean community? And I kept thinking about, what are the cultural things that people know about Korea? And in the museums are these amazing Celadon vessels. And so this project took me back to Korea, and I met the potters who are still engaging in making Celadon pottery today. It's an incredibly complex process, and many go through a formwork, firing, painting. The kilns that they use go on for days. And so what happens in production is that oftentimes many things break. And there was my inspiration, that the potters had decided that much of the production is not perfect, and therefore it goes to waste. I decided to import 2 tons of this ceramic waste to create my art installation, to create beauty out of what was obviously an imperfection, so that we find beauty within those details, and yet it's a celebration of our cultural heritage and our own history. And so in the public subway, that you would see little treasures of Korea. And then later on, when I did the project in Dallas, I re-imported this idea in sculptural form, and in their Zen garden, positioned these 8 feet mosaics out of discarded shards. And imagining that one would discover a Korean treasure in Dallas. I end here by posing these questions. What does it mean for me to look at a pant cuff, one that's no one else would ever see? And what does it mean for a potter to have destroyed their work and for me to have rescued that little shard of ceramic? I use these humble leftovers as a way to celebrate potential and for us to redefine what we value in our society. I leave you with one last lesson of art, which is perspective. For drawing perspective to exist, you have to stand in a single point of view. And then you draw the line and you create a vision. But in reality, that is unsustainable. We don't exist in a single point of view. We must recognize that we need to see the world in many perspectives. Thank you.